National Fight for Racial Justice. I am Cassandra Thiano, Assistant Director for Human Rights and Public International Law at the Office of Social Justice Initiatives, short for SJI at Columbia Law School. Welcome to our panel, the last one for the SJI Monday series that focused on themes related to racial justice, COVID, and elections. The Office of Social Justice Initiatives is a public interest career office of Columbia Law School, and our aim is to prepare the next generation of change agents to lead efforts to make the world a better place. More than just a career office, we also see ourselves as an advocacy center, both as a hub for activity and taught leadership around social justice and social change at the law school, and as a force for advocating for justice on behalf of our students, graduates, and the larger world. We believe strongly that we have a responsibility to educate ourselves and each other on the role of the law in the creation and continuation of injustice, both domestically and globally. Now is the time to think deeply about our own roles in the legal system and how we can use our legal training to respond to these injustices. We encourage our students and graduates to fight for a system in which they believe, for a world in which they want to live, one in which the statement, Black Lives Matter, isn't just a slogan, but a way of life. So with that, I wish to express my gratitude to the Human Rights Institute and BALSA who have made this discussion possible. I would also like to thank our panelists who have so generously given of their time for this discussion. So here's how we're going to proceed. Because we are pressed for time, we will not read each panelist's bio, but they will be added to the chat box. Just so everyone knows, however, we are joined today by Justin Hansford, Professor of Law and Executive Director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard Law School, Dominique Day, Chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, and Natasha Bannon of Latino Justice. We are also awaiting Commissioner Margaret May McCulley, Commissioner on the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, and also the Rapporteur on the Rights of Afro-Descendant Persons and Against Racial Discrimination. She's having some technical difficulties, but hopefully she can join us shortly. So with that, I am going to pass the mic to Udi Namdi and Dante Violette, our amazing BALSA members, who are going to lead us into the discussion. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box throughout the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Udi Namdi. I'm a 3L at Columbia. And thank you guys so much for joining both those participants and our lovely panelists. We wanted to kick off by starting by asking each of our panelists a question. And we wanted to know, since each of our panelists are involved in some form of multilateralism or using international institutions to advance racial justice, our initial question to each of our panelists is, we know that global institutions are often criticized by grassroots racial justice advocates either for being ineffective or sometimes even complicit in racial oppression globally. So do each of you believe that international institutions can be effective tools for racial justice advocacy? And also, what are some of the limitations that exist in using international mechanisms to improve the actual material conditions for Black people globally? To kick things off, I guess we'll just start off with the first person that is on my screen on the panelists, which is Justin Hansford.
It's called the luck of the draw, I guess. Well, thank you all for inviting us to speak today, Cassandra and all of the people at the Human Rights Institute. I'm very, very happy to talk to you about this issue that is very close to my heart with colleagues who I know and love and who I've worked with for many years. So thank you for this opportunity. For me, this question of whether or not international human rights institutions are helpful in the fight against racism it's an interesting one, because my career was launched in part because of my personal admiration for Malcolm X. When I was a teenager, I was rambunctious and into trouble. And when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, it really turned my life around, and I wanted to dedicate my career to trying to follow in his footsteps. His career ended just when he began to make the transition from the domestic to the global stage. His argument was that for Black people in the United States to really truly get free, we had to move from a paradigm of civil rights to human rights. And we had to avoid the contradiction of appealing to the very people who were oppressing us for freedom from oppression. In other words, if it's the United States government and the United States system that is the problem, then they're not going to at the same time turn around and be the solution. So he believed that international institutions like the United Nations were the best place to make our case. And so I launched my career with that understanding. When I happened to live near Mike Brown, about 10 minutes outside of Ferguson, when he was killed on August 9th in 2014, I was able to work with some human rights advocates to help to bring his case before the United Nations on that very foundation, arguing that Mike Brown's family and the protesters in Ferguson would get a better hearing at the UN than they would here in the United States. And I think that was true. Mike Brown's mother until today has never had a chance to make her statement before any grand jury or any criminal tribunal in the United States or civil tribunal in the United States. She had to see her son's dead body laying on the ground for 4 hours in Ferguson, Missouri. And it wasn't until she got to Geneva, Switzerland, that people actually recognized that, yes, this was a human rights violation. Yes, this is something that we think was wrong that was done to your son. So I'm very proud of the fact that I was involved in this process of using this international institution to provide a voice for people who were not given a voice here in the United States. So if the question is an international institution more effective than domestic institutions in something like giving a voice to people who are voiceless in the United States, the answer is certainly, I believe, yes, because I believe in the United States, we have some of the worst systems when it comes to giving a voice to the voiceless. Secondly, and I'm happy if people disagree with me on this, I see Natasha frowning, and Dominique too, and Joanna. I know you have a lot of good critiques for this, so I'm excited about this discussion. But secondly, I'm a critical race theorist, and as a result of that, I believe that law and politics are very difficult to distinguish. I think most people who look at the composition of the Supreme Court and how the courts have been politicized in our generation to such a degree that it seems like law and politics are one and the same. I think most of you will agree with the crits and not just critical legal studies, but critical race theorists who believe that law is politics. So for me, this idea that you are going to have somehow a fair hearing in the United States criminal justice system or civil justice system that would in some way, shape, or form provide you a legitimate forum is false unless you really take into consideration that the legal work that you do domestically is oftentimes a political campaign, in the same way that if you write a shadow report to the United Nations, there are politics involved in whether or not your shadow report gets heard. We saw that in Ferguson, where the prosecutor, Bob McCullough, clearly had a close relationship to law enforcement, clearly had his own way to manipulate that grand jury process. So the law was manipulated, and only this would have been some sort of political answer for him. So in the same way, so I believe in international institutions. I don't believe that domestic institutions are helpful. Am I breaking up?
You were towards the end.
Probably because I was talking too much. So I'm gonna take that as a sign to stop. But ultimately, I'm very bullish right now on international institutions, in part because at least in the United States, our institutions are so degraded. And I think most people will agree. The legislature, of course, the presidency, but even the courts are so degraded that you probably have a better hearing on the international level. And if you want to get if you win your case, if you want to get some sort of relief in the United States, I believe that it's political, whether or not you get your relief in the United States, in the same way it's political in terms of whether or not you can translate a UN victory into relief domestically. You have to use your UN victory to pressure local officials to get policy changes. And that's how you use international institutions to get domestic wins. Domestically, it's the same thing. Everybody saw the video of what happened to Eric Garner, right? Everybody is seeing these videos, and you're seeing that you're still not going to get any sort of semblance of justice unless you have a political campaign that shames people and pushes people in the city government to actually have to respond in some way, even though the police union will push back against that, right? So in both domestic and international spheres, it's political in terms of whether or not you get justice. Getting justice is a political project, not a project based on merit or justice, but it's a political project, whether you use the international forum or if you use the domestic forum.
Thank you so much, Professor Hansford. Dominique Day, can we move on to you as well?
Well, thank you, Udi, and I want to thank SRI and also my co-panelists, because I think this is an important conversation, and I think this is the time for us to be having it. So I really appreciate this convening. And I do agree with a lot of what Justin says. I do think these are political projects. I think international institutions exist within and respond to geopolitics. Even though we talk about human rights as somehow separate or unconnected to political considerations, we see human rights concerns and human rights priorities play out politically all the time. I think where I might disagree is that I think what a lot of us see, and sort of, especially as we look at sort of critical theory and critical race theory spaces, is that on some level, the institutions themselves are designed to perpetuate the abuses of power towards folk who look like me, right? We ultimately understand that these institutions are playing the same political games, and that's not necessarily less true when you cross a border. In fact, I think on some level, I don't disagree that our institutions here in the US are corrupt and broken. At the same time, a lot of the conversations I try to have about anti-Black racism in Europe, in South America, and elsewhere are met with not just rampant denialism, but straight up disbelief that this could be an aspect of their community. We are so invisible in these spaces. Our communities are so irrelevant to their policy that these truths that I'm often reflecting, I visited a community in your province, this is what I saw, are shocking and unbelievable to people who are decision makers for those people of African descent. I think Malcolm X is a good example here. I was going to talk a little bit about the urgent debate that was held in the Human Rights Council this summer, where the Africa group came forward and really pushed, also civil society did this in parallel, pushed for an urgent debate around systemic racism after the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, and really asked for a conversation about systemic racism, law enforcement impunity, and the ways police violence was particularly unfettered against people of African descent. And the last time the Africa group came forward to talk about this was at the behest of Malcolm X, right? I wanted to put actually our new report in the chat. I don't know if I can do that. Oh yeah, yes I can. Okay, it's gonna take me a second. I'll do it after I speak. But Malcolm X came forward and asked for there to be a reckoning for Black Americans and for the UN to step up and do this, ask the Africa group to shepherd that process, and pressure by the United States effectively squelched that request that Malcolm X made, just as it squelched the request made by W.B. Du Bois in the 1940s by NAACP, right? And so we've seen historically international institutions, even faced with clear human rights abuses. I mean, right in the 40s and 50s, we're talking about still under Jim Crow, also the 60s, right? Even faced with that, continue to prioritize the relations of power. And I think a thing that we have to sort of acknowledge and grapple with is, if we do believe in racial justice, if we do believe in social justice and change, who do we want leading that change? Who sets that agenda? And how do we actually confront the persistence of power as a priority for even people who would be our allies? The urgent debate this summer ended with a consensus resolution, decrying the existence of systemic racism. But the United States, which doesn't even sit on the UN Human Rights Council anymore, managed behind the scenes to wield enormous power to eliminate the United States as a target, to eliminate the Commission on Inquiry that was sought by advocates in the Africa Group, to structure a resolution that had very little operational language in it at all. And so you could say, okay, fine, in the last 50 years, we went from Malcolm X's request being completely erased to an actual robust debate where many member states got up and said, Black Lives Matter. Yeah, that was great. That was great for me as a Black woman. At the same time, while there may be some voice that was given in these spaces, we certainly don't see redress or accountability. And that's not a mistake. That has to do with geopolitics, that has to do with the politicization of human rights, and that has to do with the ways power continues to be an enduring principle that people sort of rally around. And so I do think there are a lot of limitations to the ways in which international institutions can help. At the same time, part of this struggle is defining our identity in struggle. And so we fight in all the spaces. And I think that is something that should continue. But again, the agenda should be set, the incentives should be determined, the leadership should remain with the communities that are impacted and the organizations that represent them. We're not going to get the kind of change we want from a UN resolution shepherded by member states. That's unlikely to happen in a world and in a transnational context that's been defined by white supremacy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Natasha, I wanted to pose the question to you as well.
I will be super brief because honestly, what can you say after both of those presentations that hasn't already been said? They really, I think, Dominique and Justin really captured the essence. I'll just add, I think that when you understand the weaknesses that have been discussed and exposed by Dominique and Justin around multilateral and institutions and international institutions, and you understand them ahead of time, you have kind of the political savviness, and then you utilize them to be able to advance movements, not to direct them. And when domestic systems fail, as they inevitably will do when state oppression is rampant, which is precisely why we look to the international community, many communities do seek international attention, if not justice itself, from different institutions in different spaces, not in absence of their own organizing, but in addition to, as a way of really trying to call accountability of international mechanisms to respond when there's no available political or judicial or legal process for them to be able to engage with within their own oppressive structures and societies. And I think that that's significant, particularly when you're able to advocate and get good people in these spaces, kind of like Margaret, who's going to be joining us shortly. And to know that, that the role, the expectations isn't that it's not going to transform a system the same way that we understand the role of movement lawyers. These are still institutions and structures that have been built for their own preservation in many ways, and in many instances to continue to provide legal cover and justification under the co-optation of the human rights framework for the very systemic oppressions that people go to those spaces to denounce. But understanding that then, thinking of how to meaningfully and strategically engage with those spaces so that we think of their role the same way we think of movement lawyers, is to understand and reflect the demands of movement, and then to be able to direct kind of resources and attention towards those movements.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dante?
Sure. Seems like the jury's still out with all of these questions. But thank you, panelists. So now we're going to move to some of the more individual questions. Dominique, we're going to start with you. So my question for you is, this year marked the midterm review for the UN's International Decade for People of African Descent from 2015 to 2024, focused on recognition, justice, development. So how much progress do you believe has been made in achieving these goals, especially regarding reparations, and what have been the major obstacles and challenges the working group has faced in advancing these themes?
Thank you, Dante. I think it's a good question. I think a lot of what Natasha just said is very relevant to this question, which is, what are the levers and the spaces in which we can create space for movements to weigh in, to demand, to make demands, to set an agenda? That's sort of what the decade's become, right? The decade, we're halfway through the decade. I'm not sure there's any metric by which you would say there has been progress. That's kind of as generously as I can say it. But at the same time, you could also look at the resource structuring of it on the front end and say, okay, this obviously wasn't designed as a vehicle for change. This at best is designed as an opportunity for people to have another lever to pull, another tool in the toolbox in local movements, in national context, a space for internal champions to really find, you know, an area to dig their teeth into around mobilizing people. And we've seen that in some places. In Nova Scotia, which has a very robust and longstanding population of African Nova Scotians, back to sort of people who were British loyalists during the Revolutionary War, people who escaped enslavement in the United States, people who just thought Washington was going to be a disaster for Black people because he was an enslaver, right? We have this population of Black folk who've been there for centuries, and yet in a country like Canada that is nothing but space, lack title to their land, have lacked meaningful access to every kind of opportunity, despite legal reform allegedly intended to redress that. And we've seen, you know, Nova Scotia adopted a plan under the International Decade called Count Us In that seeks to really aggressively confront, as they stated, right, as their premier has stated, systemic racism as it exists in their communities and really dismantle it. So we've seen some spaces that have really, where people have really like driven into that gray area and expanded sort of what needs to happen. People who've organized locally have really been able to use the decade as an opportunity to really mobilize their communities, sometimes mobilize their political leadership and others. And I think that is sort of as much progress as you could talk about, given the resource structure, given the timing of it. We'll see if we get a permanent forum, which we're hoping we will. But I think the same is true for reparations. We're having more conversations about reparations today than we ever have before. We have, we saw Ta-Nehisi Coates and others testifying before Congress around HR 40. We've seen, you know, there's a CARICOM 10-point plan that's been around for a minute, but then the conversation even in the US has really become very robust. Some of this was obviously around the presidential primary and the fact that a lot of the Democratic candidates were really engaging this idea of reparations. But it wasn't as, you know, in my lifetime, a lot of the conversation about reparations has almost been entertainment, right? It has been like so not taken seriously that we don't even engage with it. And that's not where we are at this point. So again, I don't know that we're seeing robust steps being taken toward really understanding or adopting a reparatory justice model. At the same time, that conversation's happening in ways it wasn't before. And obviously that is what needs to happen, right? We need to actually sort of piece through that discourse. So, you know, when I think about, like, I spent a good amount of time promoting the decade. And when I do that, a lot of it is about seize this opportunity to tell your stories, to make it clear what those truths are, because a lot of our own work involves really just trying to uplift the realities of people's lives for the people who are decision makers, for the people who have the resources to do something about it. And so we hope the decade can actually offer something in that vein, but at the same time, I don't think anybody, it's certainly not me, but I don't think anybody is satisfied with the progress. And certainly we've had a really effective evaluation of it from about March until, you know, August of this year, as we've watched police violence against Black bodies everywhere in the world. So I think we know what we've accomplished and have not accomplished. At the same time, I think it does continue, especially in the second half, to be an opportunity for engagement and an opportunity to set an agenda with at least the imprimatur of UN support.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. I know we're still awaiting Margaret. So Professor Hansford, we would also like to ask you a specific question. And we know that based on your past response, you showed a lot of optimism towards using international institutions to give a voice to the voiceless. And we wanted to ask, this is something that I'm very passionate about in my research, but I've noticed in your scholarship as well. Do you believe that police brutality in the US qualifies as an international crime or a crime under international law? And also, if so, going off of actually what Dominique was just discussing, would you believe that reparations would be one of those potential forms of redress if it does satisfy the elements of an international crime?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. I do agree that police violence and also mass incarceration would satisfy many of the elements of the Rome Statute for people who are involved in doing human rights legal work. Of course, you are aware that the United States has not signed on to be held accountable by the International Criminal Court. And a lot of the discussion here is, I wouldn't say it's rhetorical. I think it's informative for us as we move forward with our advocacy and our conceptualization of what is happening to us right now. I think for a lot of people, one of the advantages of the human rights idea is allowing us to be able to think about, as human beings, as people in the movement, how do we understand right from wrong in this context? When the Rome Statute, when people talk about this question of, say, for example, something like a human rights atrocity or even the term genocide, you think about mass incarceration, there are statistics that would frame what is happening to Black people in the United States in a global context where, for example, there are more Black people right now as a percentage of the population in jail or prison than there were Black people in jail or prison in apartheid South Africa during its height. And you look at, and we think about the number of people killed by police, there's really very little precedent for it. And there have been studies that have shown that the mental health impact of the fear and the terror that has been instilled in the Black community in the United States, especially in the weeks, and I think the research, which was done by some university, and I think it might have been the American Psychological Association that signed on to it. But they showed that within 3 months of a police killing that is widely shown on the networks, the blood pressure of Black Americans goes up more than others, and tension and stress, and it's equal to the effect of diabetes on the Black population in terms of its tangible health effects. So if you combine all these things, the outcome is something that would be comparable to many other human rights violations around the world. I think where people get caught up on the question of whether this is a international human rights violation and something on the level of genocide is this question of intent. Is this something that was intentional, or is this something that is simply accidental, or people simply making mistakes? Or is this unconscious bias? Things like that. And when you see reports like the Ferguson report or other police reports where you begin to learn the deeply insidious nature of what is happening in the United States, whether it's from the perspective of thirst for profit in the context of racial capitalism and the desire to make money off of these systems of punishment, or whether it's simply the infiltration of white supremacists and white nationalists into law enforcement in the United States, or the Southern strategy on political level. And, there's so many different instances of intent, and there actually is an argument I would make. And I think UD, you also might make this argument based on your research. I think there's an argument for that. But what's interesting is, what do we do next, right? And I think that's what goes back to the wonderful insights that Dominique has expressed, I think through the UN decade, and also the Special Rapporteur on Racism, Tendai Achueme, who has been very much outspoken on this issue, and I think has also written on this issue. I think there's a broader understanding of the need for reparations, not just for enslavement, but reparations for Jim Crow and reparations for police violence and mass incarceration. And I think that's again is a type of call for justice that comes from the movements on the ground, that comes from the grassroots, and it is not clear yet whether international institutions are ready for that. And I think that speaks to what Natasha has raised. These institutions are sort of inching away from the basic colorblind equality framework, which is really just the same framework that the US Supreme Court uses to avoid accountability for its own crimes domestically. We're trying to inch away from that in the international context, but to get to the point where people are ready to allow for reparations to really become a centerpiece of the dialogue, I think there's some way to go. But Tendai has made some great strides, and I'm very excited about the direction things are heading. And I'm going to put into the chat a document that she wrote that I think speaks to some of these issues and her thought leadership on the question.
Thank you. So now we're going to move to Natasha. This part of the conversation is a little bit more intersectional. So how has Black Lives Matter intersected with Latinx struggles for racial justice globally, particularly in countries such as Puerto Rico and Brazil? And how do you anticipate the Black Lives Matter movement working in tandem with Afro-Latinx racial justice movements in the future? And then also moving a little bit more domestically, in the recent US elections, a high percentage of Latinx voted for President Trump in spite of his rhetoric when it comes to Latinos. So how does that complicate the fight for racial justice in Latinx communities?
Always complicated when people vote against their own interest. So, I mean, I really appreciate these questions and a chance for us to both think about, intersectionality in this way, and also really to talk about the anti-Black racism that plays out often in the Latinx space and communities. I think in terms of the global context and how the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black Lives has resonated in many ways and struggled throughout the region, throughout Latin America, is that it's important to understand it as both lifting of what happens in colonial and neo-colonial contexts, which I think of Latin America still is very much a neo-colonial project in many ways, or at least treated as such. And that what often happens in our countries, in these spaces, is that local struggles don't always get lifted up until there is kind of a reciprocal moment in empire that then plays into it. So in places like Puerto Rico, which is a colony of the United States, the struggle for racial justice in the US, which has long been a struggle in Puerto Rico against anti-Black racism on the island, in a Black and Brown society overwhelmingly, and in a way that's linked and explicitly with feminist anti-austerity and anti-colonial struggles, got heard in a very different way. You had the first Black, openly gay woman elected just a couple of weeks ago to the legislature, who ran on her record of intersectional struggle. It was Black Puerto Rican women, including queer women, who led the initial protests last year and calls to oust the former governor, who was successfully ousted for the first time by the island. And so the language and demands of Black Lives Matter, I think, have been infused with those demands in this particular colonial context. And because of similarities that exist within Black communities in the US and on the island, or throughout the Caribbean, or really throughout the region, that live in neo-colonial conditions often, where actual self-determination, the language of self-determination is so important in a colonial context that often we remove a neo-colonial context and we reduce it to other more accessible controllable rights like voting. You know, we reduce the notion of large political rights to just something that can, that the state could regulate and control and direct to state regulated spaces in order to remove the actual struggles of self-determination from where they're won, which is on the streets. And in colonial context, they really understand that. And so seeing the racial justice movement over the summer gave, you know, infused, I think, and gave an opportunity in Puerto Rico, particularly, to examine the threads of island racism that really permeate the society and are present in the replications of colonial violence that take place, and to understand them through the lens of racial justice and not just kind of a whitewashed colonial struggle. And I think that's also true in kind of neo-colonial contexts throughout the region, in Brazil, in Colombia. You know, Black liberation struggles have long marked social and political justice movements, and also state repression as a result. I mean, we all heard about Mario Franco's assassination, which really reflected that, but also Bolsonaroism, which is really just the Brazilian version of Trumpism, and understanding both of those in the context of like the global rise of fascism that produced them both, and who Bolsonaro models himself after and takes, you know, the leeway of being able to use the same type of state repressive tactics on Black and Brown and Indigenous communities there. And that the same way then that US politics kind of reverberates globally, so does US movement activism, right? Not because it originates in the United States, and I think we have to remove that lens of US exceptionalism that permeates so much of US movement spaces, but because what's resonating is that those long existing struggles that have decades, if not centuries of existence, of denouncing state sponsored and sanctioned violence, get lifted up and understood in a different light. And, you know, ultimately, the same kind of settler colonialism and genocide that has infused white supremacy in political ruling classes and the legal structures that prop them up exist throughout Latin America. Though I do think Latin America in many ways has made more advances in challenging that through legal formalism and kind of adjusting constitutions and laws in ways that we haven't been able to successfully see in the US, even though it's always been backed and fueled by social movements. They don't always talk about anti-Black racism. And so that's why we don't see Black activists centered in the front of these struggles, even though they are. And instead, in places like Colombia, it's often Black movement leaders that are being assassinated by state or paramilitary forces, which is not different from armed, you know, Trump supporters or militiamen, you know, in the United States. We also have to understand that as paramilitary forces. But it's the reason they're targeted is precisely because of how successful they've been in organizing and how their demands go beyond kind of the individualization even of the human rights framework and seek collective rights that challenge capitalism, that challenge monocrop monopolies and the oligarchy, and that they have been organizing around self-defense in ways to protect not just their bodies, but their lands and their communities. And the Black Lives Matter movement has allowed the world, and in the context of Colombia, you know, Colombians to understand those demands in a light not just of Colombia's own racism, but structural racism and how it operates. And so, you know, for better or worse, I guess, of how the US is, you know, it kind of has given a gloss of legitimacy in many ways by allowing others to understand those in the context of a people, not just in their own society. It lifts up those demands, I think. And in terms of kind of on the home front, the Latinx vote and how so much, particularly of mainstream media, has focused on how more Latinas and Latinos voted, really Latinos, because Latino men voted for Trump, which isn't the only demographic that where people shifted to vote for Trump. You know, the trends that I was just talking about, those migrate with people, right? People don't leave behind their class and racial bias when they arrive in Miami or New York or anywhere else. And the proximity to whiteness that is so prevalent in the Latinx community gets really lifted up when you have campaign rhetoric of scares of like socialism that goes to the deeply, you know, the economic interests that are so deeply embedded with white supremacy that exists throughout the region. And that it isn't so much, I think, about US politics that they're voting on as much as about Latin America politics and their continuous efforts to undermine social and political progress there, that they're kind of seen as proxy votes in a way. But that narrative also really ignores, which I just want to be, I think it's important that we talk about the folks that decided to vote for Trump, because what gets left out, what gets talked about as though they're scared of socialism. What doesn't get talked about is white supremacy, right? And how that is infusing so much of this, particularly in the pockets where we see that happening. But what hasn't gotten spoke about also is the tremendous organizing that took place in swing states in the Latinx community that really helped turn and flip a lot of those states, and that was the result of deep organizing directly in response to the xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies that have come out of this administration. And, while I think it's true that the Latinx organizing around, political power hasn't been as connected as it should be, I think, with Black organizing in a way. And part of that, I think, is that we haven't challenged enough the narratives that see those as like separate and unrelated powers and not as a mutual path towards collective liberation. That is something that we need to definitely kind of address more. And I think that that's a much more interesting point to focus on, instead of why are folks in Miami and South Texas voting Republican, for example, instead of, the thousands that came out. Like, how can we more intentionally think about connecting them with the most significant, political and civil rights struggle of our time, which has been Black Lives Matter.
Wow, thank you guys all so much. There's so much to think about. And I think that each of you, with like having such amazing careers thus far, have a lot of input that you can give to us young budding lawyers in the legal community. So our kind of closing question to each of you, knowing that there are a lot of law students, both on the Zoom or watching via YouTube live, what would be your advice or parting words to law students specifically that are interested in both racial justice and international human rights, who may be feeling honestly disillusioned or having their own individual reservations about entering the field? And I guess we will start with Professor Hansford.
I think that I would encourage the students to go for it. And this is a piece of advice that I give to students that I know a lot of people don't like me to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. Do not take bar classes. Do not take classes that they tell you you're supposed to take. Take all the human rights classes. Take all the race and the law classes. Take all the critical race theory classes that you can possibly take, because those are the classes that have enriched my ability to be able to operate in this space, not as just a functionary, someone who just fills the legal human rights documents out and is not thinking critically, using the most cutting edge scholarship and ideas on race and injustice and human rights. But I've actually been able to think in addition to work in the field, because I was able to buck the advice to just, take corporations and whatever, and actually take what I wanted to take and pursue my career. And this is a great career. I mean, you get a chance to do something that you really care about. People at these firms, Jones Day or whatever, they make a lot of money, but you see the type of work they're having to do now. Some of them are having to represent the Trump administration. And, I think that I'm paid in a different sort of currency. I'm paid in the currency of being able to live out my dream. And to me, it's better than the other type of currency. But it's not that I didn't take a vow of poverty to do this work, but I think it's well worth it. And I think everybody should give it a shot if you're passionate about it.
Thank you. Dominique, do you have some insights to add?
Sure. I really agree with what Justin has said. I think I took like one day of tax in law school, and I realized this was a space that was designed to habituate me into white supremacy and the exploitation of poor people, and just by making it possible for others not to pay tax. And I think that's true. Like, you need to lean into your intellectual curiosity. You need to really cultivate your expertise in the areas that you're interested in. At the same time, I think there's space for us to understand that if you're going to adopt a professional identity of struggle, that you also have to build your resilience, right? You may do this for a couple of years. I'm often doing this for a couple of years, this for a couple of years, to really just shift the grounds on which I'm facing often devastating disappointment. I think at the same time, the most innovative and important work in racial justice spaces and in social justice spaces comes from